Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give the attendees just one more minute to join the link, and then I'll set us off in the next minute or so. All right. Thank you so much for making the time to be here. My name is Christine Mungai. I am the curator at Baraza Media Lab. We are a co-creation space that is partly a co-working space, partly providing other kinds of support for Kenyan media creators. I'm also a writer and journalist. And the journalist part of my work is a really, really important part of the work that I do. Started off at Nation Media Group with most of the people on this panel, I would say the majority. We were colleagues at Nation at one time or another. That was, I won't say how many years ago that was, but I would say that despite everything else that we've branched off into doing, including this work here at Baraza and what we'll hear from our panelists, at the end of the day, what we do is really shaped by that, by the institution that shaped all of us, typified by this mainstream media organization. But so much has changed since those days. Technology has disrupted so much of the work that we do. Breaking news no longer has a competitive edge. I would say that this was definitely not the case even just a few years ago. Fake news has become a mainstream slogan. It's that phrase has kind of been mainstreamed. And what it takes to survive in this kind of ecosystem will require media organizations and creators to really look for innovative ways to stay relevant. And very much so here in Africa. These are conversations I think that we have had and have been having in many different forums, but we are here with a power panel to kind of put it all together for us. And allow me to introduce the panel. Like I said, they are friends and colleagues, beginning with Patrick Gathara, who is the curator-in-chief at The Elephant, an independent media organization based here in Nairobi, fully digital and doing amazing work. He will be joined by Dr. Njoki Chege, Director of Media Innovation Center at Aga Khan University, friend and colleague as well, a journalist, columnist in her own right. We're also joined by Churchill Otieno, digital editor at Nation.Africa. We stopped being Nation Media, now Nation.Africa, which really, puts the spotlight on an African media organization that is not just looking inward, but looking outward. What does it take to build a truly formidable Pan-African media organization? And finally, by Ephraim Mushemi, who has joined us from IREX, who will also be bringing his insights and his 2 cents into this conversation, which really touches on all of us, not just as journalists, as media creators, but even more importantly, as consumers of media. And I think that applies to everyone, right? Everyone is involved and important in this discussion because we all consume media. So having said that, I'm going to just pass the mic to Mr. Gathara here, who will moderate this panel, and we can look forward to some amazing insights over the next hour or so. Patrick.
Thanks a lot, Christine. Thanks for that introduction. Basically, the theme of what we'll be looking at would be about media sustainability and viability in this new environment? What are the models that are being tried out? What are the challenges that media is facing, and how can they overcome it so that they can actually keep, stay online? Maybe I'll just start with you, Njoki. Maybe you guys have done lots of research on what's happening in the media space, both in Kenya and across the world and the continent. So maybe you could just lay out the context for us. What does it look like for media enterprises in Kenya today?
Not good, Gathara. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Christine, Maurice, and the Baraza Lab team. It's a real pleasure to be here. Gathara, to answer your question, it's not looking very good for news media organizations, particularly the ones that are not the so-called legacy news organizations. And this was actually a problem even pre-COVID. I mean, COVID just made things much more apparent. We are having journalists lose their jobs by the numbers. I think as at last year, the Kenya Editors Guild, I think it was around December, the Kenya Editors Guild had said almost, I think about 300 journalists had lost their jobs. And we are seeing not just mass layoffs, but also we are seeing significant cost cutting in the so-called news media organizations, but also we are seeing less resources when it comes to storytelling. A lot of news organizations do not have the resources that is needed for storytelling, whether it is in-depth reporting and all that. Now, there's some news organizations that have the financial muscle that can tap into their reserves and into their cash reserves and do storytelling, but for majority, it's not looking good. And for particularly the ones that we particularly support, the startups, the journalism startups, while they have seen an uptick of news consumption, the question of news viability, of viability and sustainability still becomes very relevant. So we all know that they cannot depend on digital advertising. Not even the so-called legacy can depend on digital advertising. So they have to go into other new forms of or new business models, whether we are talking about native advertising, are we talking about philanthrojournalism, that is the grant-funded journalism, and that is a big area that we are seeing right now, particularly for the startups that we are supporting. And we're also seeing some of them actually open branches or small departments within their startups to do digital advertising, small digital agencies where they can do client sponsored work. So it's not looking good, but there's a bit of hope. I think this has really made journalists and news media organizations at large to really think outside the norm. I don't want to say think outside the box, but really to think outside the norm, because the advertising business model is really not going to cut it for the years to come.
Could I just ask, is sustainability and viability the same thing as being profitable, as profitability?
Okay, so many times we have interchanged, sustainability and viability. But for us here at the Innovation Center, I think we are much more keen on viability. And we understand media viability to be the capacity of news organizations to produce high quality journalism that is commercially sustainable or viable. So I think media viability has a lot to do with the business model. And also it has a lot to do with the quality of the journalism. Sustainability, I think for me, it's a much more general term. And it's sometimes I think when it comes to sustainability, you don't really, the business model doesn't really matter. But when it comes to media viability, I think the business model is at the center of it all.
Okay. Chachi, let me just come to you. I just like to read something that you had said at the end of 2019, before we had all these issues with COVID. You had said 2020 will see newspaper-based media houses in Kenya aggressively experiment with paywalls. Many of these will fail due to impatience. They will fail mostly because the temperament, values, and cultures that drive an advertising-based business model are different from those that drive a subscription-based one. Yet there is not enough time at hand to drop the old habits and embrace new ones. Now, Nation is one of the people who are aggressively experimenting with paywalls. Is it failing for you guys?
Thanks, Gathara, and a good afternoon to the panel and to participants joining us this afternoon. Fairly important topic we're addressing today. The short answer is that in many respects, yes, there are many levels in which it is failing, and it helps that we went in knowing that there'll be areas of failure. So the main takeaway for us are there lessons that we are learning as we go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of them are good lessons. Things we thought would take us long to get going, happening a lot faster than we imagined, and therefore us running around the building trying to make sure that all the ducks are aligned for the bigger volume of subscribers that have come through, or the bigger amount of registrations that are happening, or the sheer number of calls that we're having to deal with because people want to talk to us given one or other challenges they're having to go through. So those are failures, but on the back of them, there are huge lessons going forward. Thank you.
Could you share some of those lessons?
In the comment that you've read, the main thing for us is that what the world sees is a paywall. When a newsroom goes that route, what the world sees is a paywall. But to deliver and sustain that paywall, a few things must then change. One, the totality of the newsroom, the nature, shape, feel, temperament, and even tempo of the newsroom has changed. People sit in different ways. We have in September last year, we announced a new raft of titles and positions, some that people felt were very, very strange. And as we walk this journey, we are having to bring in disciplines that previously were never part of the newsroom. We now have engineers sitting in the newsroom, trying to help figure out how stories should be told. We are very, very concerned and keen on how our customers or audiences, as we've always known them, are interacting with our content, what they like, what they don't like, and what insights that should then push into the editorial decision making. So we're having more and more data analysts, statisticians sitting with us. It used to be that marketing folks are guys who wait at the door of the factory, for the product to come out and then they run around with it. Right today, we are having to sit with them from the get-go. Yeah, many of which are things that we didn't imagine we're gonna have to work with. But today,
so the Chinese wall between advertising and the editorial department that has disappeared.
Actually, there's no Chinese wall. It doesn't come up because in a paid content model, your revenues come from your audiences. In the advertising model, your audience is the product, because ideally you're selling, you use your content to aggregate audiences, which audiences you then sell to advertisers.
Right.
But in the new space, the consumer is the same person who is paying you.
Right.
So it is a good thing because if you're not giving the consumer what they want, then they simply won't pay you. So I think it's a good thing for journalism because it pushes us back to the core of trust issues in journalism.
Right. I think we'll circle back onto this and ask about whether giving audiences what they want is what journalism should be about. But just before we get to that, maybe Ephraim, you guys do a lot of training for both journalists, media houses and stuff. How prepared are they for this new environment that they're operating in?
Well, thank you so much, Gathara, and the panelists and everyone who's here. So that's a very good question. I remember way back in the day, around 2009, and then 2010 and 2011, I wrote 3 articles in total about the changing landscape, and I was kind of warning journalists that the landscape is changing, you need to prepare and so forth. But now with the kind of work that we're doing and meeting journalists around East Africa and from the grassroots level also, I am seeing there's one of the biggest issues that we do have is in East Africa, we're mostly reactionary. We wait until there's a shift, then you're like, oh, wait, I need to change now. And that now is actually like 5 years ago. And by then you're already late. So I do believe one of the things we might have to encourage more of us is to change attitudes of not only just being reactionary, but more about planning ahead to see how things are changing.
Is that still the case? Even so many of them are losing their jobs already.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sad thing. I get so many calls about, hey, I need to learn how to use a blog. And these are the same people 10 years ago I was trying to teach them how to set up a blog. And now they're coming back and saying, show me how to do this. And most of them need a lot of hand holding. And that is very unfortunate. And I feel very sad about it. And these are not like people who don't have access, or that is access to education or access to trainers and so forth. But I don't know where we went wrong to a point that we need to be shown the way, like with that, at night when you're walking, you're normally gonna touch it. That's the direction it seems to be going, which is very unfortunate. But the enterprising nature in us needs to be brought out. And I had a very good example in Ethiopia where one media house was shutting down, and the owner had a small media outlet. He just said, I need to talk to somebody. We chatted. He ended up shifting his whole business model from being more the traditional mainstream, and he started thinking about, why don't I look at the consumer, what the consumer needs, and then I produce my content around what the consumer's capacity of getting access to this information. So now they're even using they've got representatives across the region, and they are producing short content for WhatsApp, because there's noticed that the people out there, they get content through WhatsApp mostly. They don't even watch news in a normal way. So that adapting ended up them getting more grants. And now he has got a big, the media house has grown, and they've even opened a section for fighting disinformation, which is so impressive, that the funders, so that he can be able to help fight disinformation through the platform he has been able to create. Right. So yes, we have to think along, thinking ahead.
Okay, Njoki, I mean, all this to me seems predicated on an idea that I think is a bit controversial, that news should pay for itself. Is it the case that we should be giving people what they are willing to pay for and calling that news?
Okay, so I think, first of all, I come from the school of thought that the newspaper or the news business is a business like any other. This is what C.P. Scott, the founder, former publisher of The Guardian, said about maybe 100 years ago, that the newspaper is first and foremost a business, and then it is an institution. So, and the business of news is not cheap. It's very expensive to produce a high quality 3,000 word piece or 30 minutes, TV, story. Having said that, I think that we can approach this issue of media sustainability in 2 ways. first and foremost, for privately owned news media organizations, they have to make money, and I think they have to make their audiences pay for content, and the content has to be high quality content. Like I said earlier at the beginning of this talk, the advertising business model is done. And we're not blaming Facebook and we're not blaming Google, because I don't believe that Google and Facebook are the problem with our news media industry today. Internet is. It's the internet. It's the internet that allows people to access news and information without going through, the distribution channels of the likes of Churchill and the Standard and all that. So the internet has made the news very much available. Of course, a lot more needs to be done by Google and Facebook to enable news organizations to produce high quality news. But what I believe is that the advertising model is done, it's dusted. So now news organizations need to think otherwise. So the first thing that they're doing is through paywalls, but then paywalls will not work at least for a long time. So it's sort of like a long hockey stick that will take maybe 5 or 10 years, depending on the organization. And it's going to be a long and painful process that demands a lot of patience. Secondly, we are also seeing them get into strategic partnerships. And this is where the issue of, native advertising is coming through. So audiences that can pay for news, audiences that want high quality news analysis, interviews and all that should pay for news. I believe in that. But then there's also the other side of the coin. I also believe that we need a well-funded, strong and independent public broadcasting, service or system. We need a very strong public media system. And that is the one that provides still high quality news and information, but for free. And those people who can pay for it will pay for it, and pay for it in such a way that it allows other people who are not able to pay for it, which is the majority in our country, for example, in our context, because this is not the New York Times or the Financial Times context. Those people who cannot pay for it should also access. So I hope I'm very clear.
I think, and I want to bring Churchill on this. I mean, I'll just make a quick point about what you mentioned about Scott and The Guardian, that The Guardian is actually not being run as a business.
Absolutely.
Not, so there are other things. I mean, Churchill, for you, do you consider the nation as basically a hawker for stories, or do you have a higher a vision or a higher mission? Is it, I mean, how, to what extent do you gauge success in a story? Is it just by how many people can pay for it?
Our mission is to empower Africa. That's what Nation.Africa stands for. And we see that as a journey where you could look at Nation and its journalists as the, the guidance, but the people in the journey is a multitude across the continent. It is a people who believe in certain values, hold those values dearly, and care because those values mean something for their lives today and tomorrow. But to make sure that this journey keeps happening, we must find a way to generate resources along the way. Resources that does not contaminate the clarity with which we envision the destination that we need to go for. That's how Nation looks at it. So we are committed to independent journalism, but we're also clear that for us to get that going, there has to be a process put in place that then makes resources available without undermining
I think the question
the whole essence of our coming together.
What is that process and what is the balance there? Because if you say for example, that it's only people who can afford to pay the nation who will read the nation, then that's a very tiny minority. Even when before the internet and COVID, it was only a very small percentage of Kenyans who could read a newspaper, who got access to a newspaper. So how do we,
I was getting there,
yeah.
Gathara.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted. Okay, go ahead.
The configuration of the nation paywall today targets only 20% of our audience. The larger majority, 80% of the nation audience, is still able to consume nation content without having to pay. A few of them may have to register to be able to consume, but the larger majority pretty much would consume our content in very much the same way they used to before. Okay?
Right. And what then does that look like as a model? Because will the 20% be able to pay enough so that the 80% can view the nation, or is nation thinking? I mean, what are you seeing this going to? If Jockey is right that advertising is done and dusted, how will you fund the nation?
I actually don't agree with Jockey on that point. Advertising remains pretty much part of the game. What has happened is that it has shrunk, you know. While in the previous regime, advertising, I mean, most newsrooms, most media houses depended on one major revenue pipeline, advertising. Going forward, we'll need multiple pipelines, but each of those pipelines will be a lot smaller compared to what advertising was. So you want to maintain and sustain a certain healthy level of advertising going forward, but you want a healthy mix of other sources, paywall being one of them, to keep going forward. Yes, right. And for that reason, even the question around where Google and Facebook should play is an important one, you know, because they are extracting lots of value out of the, you know, sweat of journalists. We must find a way to make sure that they participate in making sure the journalism continues to happen.
Do you want something like what we have in Australia, the law that they were passing that forces then Google and Facebook to contribute revenues to media houses?
The industry will have to figure that out. We just got out of a meeting this weekend where the entire media industry came together and were confronting some of these questions. And we are basically saying, we can have a conversation about the how, but the end game must be that everybody drawing benefits out of journalism should give back and make sure good journalism can continue to happen, but not just happen. Good journalism needs to thrive because our nation is the defender of our nation, if you like.
Right. Ephraim, in terms of individual journalists, people working at Nation, the Elephant, whatever, what is their obligation when it comes to making sure these enterprises make money?
Yeah, that's a good one. I've had so many conversations on this, and probably I can add on to what Dr. Njoki and what Churchill have also mentioned in regards to the ad. Is the advertisement business dead and are connected to the journalist? First of all, I don't believe it is dead. And I do believe it's more like it just requires a rethink. One thing which actually came out in many of the conversations I've had with the journalists, especially in the mashinane, there in the grassroots, is they themselves don't even know what 1.0 is. What is a 1.0 consumer? And for them, it's more like I need to produce high quality content to be read by a specific group of people who Safaricom may end up marking up for them, for example, or maybe a specific airline and so forth. And so I'll like giving examples. There's a group of journalists in Western Kenya. They were trying to find a way to end up making money by creating a small media outlet. They were trying to mimic the Nation model or the Standard Group model. So we sat down, and the one thing I asked them, have you thought about asking that Mamboga there to help to advertise? And again, with that, you may need to create content which is more local, like what happened to a farmer specific place, which affects that Mamboga over there. And for her, I'm sure she won't mind paying 100 shillings for 2 weeks month worth of advertising. She will find an edge, hearing her voice over an edge over the other people. And then soon other people will just run in. By that, I also remember asking in Lodwar, asking them again, has that petrol fuel station advertised by any chance? These are the people who are being missed out, and they could end up making revenue out of them. So it will be interesting to find maybe a bigger media outlet, for example, Nation Media House or Standard or the others, breaking down the media houses to probably, even the advertising, to start grabbing these small little people, businesses down there to even chip into the advertisement. But it might require also localizing the content much further, which I'm not sure whether that's kind of that kind of work. It's something it'd be willing to. It's going to be a lot, but yes, there is a lot of money which can still be gotten from the ground.
Yeah, but what I was wondering is within places like Nation. I mean, before it used to be you employed, you write stories, somebody else goes and sells them. You know, if you're getting to a point where these stories themselves have to be profitable, have to generate, whether it's subscribers or generate money, do our journalists have to go beyond simply being good journalists to start thinking their choices of material has to be something that can be sold?
Yeah, for sure. They really have to up their game in regards to not only just the quality of work that they do, but also seeing themselves as the marketers of their work too. So that way they can continue selling themselves and their brand, whether it's their own individual brand or the organization's brand or whichever they're working with.
Yeah. And this is for all of you. Don't you see a problem there? You know,
could I say something before you raise the problem?
Yeah, go ahead, Judge.
I think the answer to the question I just asked is that the nature and shape of good journalism has changed. So if you're going to be a good journalist, then you must just then recalibrate and measure up the new merit, so to speak. Merely going out and regurgitating a press release, a different age, that was good journalism.
Right.
Today, somebody will still publish you, but it will make very little difference. Yeah. So then the challenge then for us is to ask, what is the new definition of good journalism, and how do we make sure that those of us practicing journalism consistently do it? Joki and I were at an event at the beginning of last week where the Editors Guild and the Aga Khan University were signing an MOU, and the chairperson of the Media Owners Association came and told us to our face that many of them feel that they're strangers in the newsroom, that journalists must and should, shape up to the task and take leadership of these media enterprises through the next phases. That's what we're talking about.
But again, just to ask then, for the nation, what is this new definition of journalism? What would you say it is? What is good journalism today?
I could speak the whole day what it is, but to say that in a sentence, it is journalism that is consequential to the consumer's lives. Yeah. So it means that sometimes you delight your consumers with things they didn't know existed, or they didn't know existed in the nature that you give it to them. But now that you've made them aware of it, they feel empowered to deal with their life issues as they were.
Right, but being consequential, and Joki, maybe you can come in here. Being consequential, is that defined by the willingness or ability of your consumer to pay for it?
No, it doesn't. I think, news consumers will, okay, depending on what they pay for, you might think that that is what they think of what should be good journalism, but it isn't. And you asked the important question, should audiences be always given what they want? The answer is no. Sometimes you need to give them information that they don't even think that they need. And going back to Churchill's point about consequential journalism, and I agree that the tenets of journalism have largely not changed. The tenets of what constitutes great, wonderful, high quality journalism have not changed, whether it is boldness, independence, speaking truth to power, truth, and all that. I think what has changed is the shape and the form. And that's why we're seeing, organizations like the Nation Media Group and even some of the startups that we work with, they're trying to tell the story in different ways, whether it is through augmented reality or even through visuals and all that. So I basically think that the audiences, in as much as they're willing to pay for high quality news, there's also some news that and some information that they might not think that is necessary for them, but you as the journalist, as the editor, as the editorial director or whoever, you feel that this information is what is needed by the audiences. So sometimes you've got to give them what they want and what they don't think that they need.
Right. Just to add on to that, and I know there was Internews did a survey earlier this year that they released. I think it was in January or February, and one of the things that they pointed out is how every Kenyan, most Kenyans they interviewed said they don't want politics in the news coverage. But editors were saying, well, every time we replace politics with something else, nobody buys the paper. So basically what they tell you they want and what they want can be two different things. And also the fact is, if we were to look at the things that are expected of the press by the public, why we passed a constitution that specifically protects journalism, is that there's an expectation that you will do particular work. But I think that for me, the bigger question is then who pays for that? If the public is demanding certain types of journalism, should they be expected to pay for it, and what form would that take? And I think that is a discussion that can lead us to start to think about the models. So in terms of how the public contributes to how media is done, do you think there is a process or a way to go beyond simply them paying for newspapers? Probably having either public fund. I know Victor Bwire has spoken of having a fund for media, something like that. There is advertising that government utilizes. Is there a way of using these resources to feed back, to grow media, to help them actually deliver on what the Kenyans expect of them? Maybe I can start with Ifra and then come to Njoki.
Yeah. So I think there's something first which may need to be looked into first. There's something called the feedback loop, and it's in regards to the thing which you mentioned, where the public are demanding something, but they might not be getting it. And I saw something which Editors Guild tried to do the other day. Is it last year? No, 2 years before COVID, which was really impressed, and is trying to improve on the feedback loop. Like, for example, what are we feeding you, and what do you really need? But then the unfortunate thing is we have got this thing called the power distance index, where it is people may end up telling you something which they don't try to give a specific perception. They don't want to be seen that they will love that news so they can be seen that they belong in a specific class and so forth. But actually their needs are entirely different. A similar way as you can put a camera on somebody and they'll change their behavior to give you something. Yeah. But actually their needs are entirely different, and that needs to be fixed first. And if that end up having some sort of fixing, that means there might be a possibility of the increase of media consumption. I mean, journalism media consumption by the general public. A good example is if you look at, for example, how much news content is being consumed, And then if you look at how much the other content on YouTube, which is being consumed, hundreds and thousands of views. But the people may not say they're watching that, they'll say I'm watching NTV instead. But actually they get their news more from there. I mean, a good example is even from my uncle who's around nearly 80. The TV is on, but he's watching WhatsApp. He believes what he's seeing on WhatsApp. That needs to be fixed. To him, that's his feedback. His feedback group. He feels disconnected right now as it is with the media. So at times, like I know there's that what Dr. Njoki has mentioned about the public may need to be shown specific content, but actually in some places it might be very patronizing, and that actually ends up disconnecting them. There needs to be more engagement, even by the local journalist, the correspondent, asking the public, how did you find this news? Do you like it? What do you prefer? And since they sit with them in the bars, in the weddings and so forth, they should be getting that feedback group to help fix that gap.
Right. I think, Njoki, what do you think about the whole idea of models and of the public paying for news?
Yeah, so I think, like I said earlier, we can look at this from a two-pronged perspective. First of all, the ones that can afford the high quality and news behind the paywalls, like Nation Media Group or maybe Standard Group, I think they should pay. And I also think, personally, I think it is patriotic for you to support the media. But there's also the majority of Kenyans, and this is the actual reality. Majority of Kenyans who do not have access to high quality news and information, and this is impacting even their citizen participation, whether it is in elections or in public dialogues and all that. This is why I think that we need to have a system where we will support, independent public broadcasting system or service, to allow people in those areas that might not be able to access, let's say, Nation Media Group or the Standard paywall, to have access to news about themselves. But the most important thing, and I'm surprised that we're not talking about it, is the death of local news, the death of county news. We did a research early this year, and it showed the significant news deserts in Kenya. There are some areas that are not completely covered by a radio station. There's some areas that you will never get a newspaper. There's some areas that have never been covered on your local television. And it's a big problem in the United States because of course, the democratic impact of, lack of news. But in Kenya, it is a matter of life and death if we do not have radio stations reaching out to some areas. Right. So I think, and this is
how do you do that? Our media landscape is dominated by private players, people like Churchill. Those are the people who are there. Exactly. They're there to make money. So my question again is, how within that context do we build a public service? KBC is not going to do it, is it?
Well, it might. I don't know why you are completely, doing away with KBC. I wrote about it last week, and I actually think that there's so much potential with KBC. I think if we could institutionalize license fees and all that, and if we even had the government goodwill to support KBC, for example. I think KBC has one of the widest reach. The signal has one of the widest reaches across the country. So why should we support KBC, for example? You see, let me tell you, this market is stratified. There are people like Gathara and Ephraim who can pay that 750 shillings a year for a nation subscription. But there are people who cannot afford that. So what are we doing about that? And those are actually the majority. And I think that's the conversation we should be having. Over and above, why is a paywall working for Nation or what's not working? What are the lessons learned? The question should be, how should we decentralize media? How should we decentralize news and information from Nairobi to other parts of the country? Because like we all say, Nairobi is Kenya. It doesn't represent Kenya. But that's what I mean.
Yeah. I get that.
Yeah.
Churchill, what do you think about this public, the ideas of having public fund essentially for private players. Can we really expect that organizations such as Nation, Citizen, which are private and for profit, can actually fulfill a public good when it comes to media?
I don't think they have a choice in the matter. They either meet and fulfill the public good, or they atrophy. They will stop being relevant unless they speak to the bigger goals, the bigger purpose of journalism. Yeah, so it's non-negotiable. And those who've tried to do that before are littered in in the cemetery of media. And I'm also with Njoki in this, that is not whether KBC can do the job for which it is established. It must do the job. It's a question of how do we, as stakeholders, take responsibility and push KBC to do the job that it needs to do, whether it is a resourcing question or whether it is an editorial policy question. The constitution is very clear, so the rest of us just needs to come to the table and do what it takes to make sure that the KBC we have is not defined using lenses of days gone by, but is defined using the 2010 constitution going into the future. And those who've taken time to look into KBC know that there are fairly specific things that need to be done to it to make sure that it delivers fair and credible and verified information to the population of Kenya, wherever they are, in the shape that makes sense to them, on issues that have meaning to their lives.
Yeah, I think
when KBC does that, it not only serves the information needs of that population, it also will have the effect of challenging the private media, as it were, to up their games. Because I would only go to a second media if there's something that they offer that KBC is not offering. So it's a good KBC is good for everybody in our space.
Yeah, and in a sense, it would also relieve pressure on private players, because if the basics are covered, then you guys can actually concentrate on other sort of value-adding activities. I just have there's a few questions that have come through from the audience. One's asking about print media, and basically they're saying that the current generation does not relate to it. So basically, for you, Churchill, has the media recognized this, and is it addressing it effectively? I mean, will print survive?
Print will survive. I think it will serve different needs of audiences. Worst case scenario for me, it might become niche, maybe serve a smaller audience, but I see print continuing to be relevant going into the future. But of course, because of how communication happens today, the centrality of electronic devices, the centrality of the mobile phone and tablets, it means that the bigger play, the mass consumption of media will happen in those devices. Yeah. Now, it's important to distinguish media or medium from the journalism.
Right.
The content that we create, I think, remains relevant regardless of how we package it. So the question for us is, in the reality of a changing media infrastructure and media consumption habits, how do we get the journalism to stay relevant and cross all those T's and dot all those I's as we go into the future?
Right.
Yeah.
We're coming to the tail end of this. An hour is clearly not enough to even scratch the surface of this. But Ephraim, if what Churchill is saying is correct, that the journalism doesn't change because the medium changes. How I read stuff on the mobile phone to me would be different from how I would read it in the newspaper. So do you think our journalists are able to produce specifically for particular medium, or do they imagine that if you produce one thing, it will go, it can be basically distributed across platforms?
Yeah, I do think journalists should end up getting additional skills for them to be able to create content for the different mediums. And this is for the TikTok generation, who 6 seconds is enough. So how can you be able to pass quality journalism within those 6 or 30 seconds and so forth? That's going to be relevant, especially in this, as you can see how the work models are changing, even where we are working more hours and we might have less time to consume.
Can you do quality journalism on TikTok?
By the way, I do believe you can, and it's so amazing. Like no, even beyond TikTok, I right now there's a psychologist who is counseling gamers through the gaming platform. I mean,
right.
I mean, and it's not like it's just shocking to me to find this is a way he found of passing on advice and assistance to gamers. So I do believe journalists can find creative ways of using these platforms to their own, to promote quality journalism.
Right.
It's up to us to end up finding a way which works best for us Africans. Please note, I'm saying Africans. We tend to mimic a lot of the Western models, and we need to really bring it down to our level from the grassroots and see what works best for us. If it's going to be through WhatsApp, creating content where they can be able to listen every day, they receive it immediately on their phone in their mother tongue, let it be, and create a broadcast group. It becomes so enticing to them. They know I can pay 100 shillings a month from this group of journalists because they create quality content I get every morning direct on my phone. They don't have to wake up. I'm so sorry, Churchill, for you guys, but they don't have to wake up and go and buy a newspaper. So yeah,
right. I think that's a really good point that you make, and I'll throw it to Njoki in terms of indigenously developed models and ways of doing journalism. Are we seeing that evolving, or are we simply again looking at what New York Times is doing, what CNN is doing, and saying that is how it should be done?
Well, I think in as much as we appreciate what the New York Times is doing, we might also need to be, considerate of the fact that the success of the New York Times is pegged on its international audiences and its over 150 years legacy since the early 19th century, or was it mid 19th century? But I think there's a lot to learn for local news organizations from the success stories of the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, or whether it's Financial Times. But what is becoming very interesting, and we are seeing it here locally, is that a lot of those lessons learned are being applied to the local context, and they're being contextualized to fit the Kenyan, or indigenous, context. And that's what I like about it. So the general tenets remain the same, whether it's, for example, the Nation Media Group is now perfecting a new business model with the strategic partnerships, where they get, they cut out the middleman, that is the agency, the PR agency. They go directly to the client, for example, Safaricom, and they tell Safaricom, let's do this pull out. Instead of going to the agency, we do the pull out and we get 15, 20 million out of it. So that is actually what is happening with the New York Times, the strategic partnerships and all that. But they're now being tailor-made to the Kenyan system. And also something else we might not, we should not forget is that in as much as there are those idiosyncrasies that are different in Kenya and in the New York Times, in the US and all that, the audiences are pretty much more or less the same. When you ask Ephraim whether you can do journalism on TikTok, I just remember that the New York Times is doing a lot of journalism on Instagram. I mean, they are preparing slides and they're putting them on Instagram. And they've become a topic for scholarship, and media scholars all over are like, okay, so is this really about bringing the information down to the audiences, or is this dumbing down journalism? Because when you also talk about TikTok journalism, does it mean that we are dumbing down issues? For example, if put Christine Mungai, one of Kenya's finest journalists, to do a TikTok about BBI. Are we dumbing it down, or are we bringing it closer to the audiences? Now that is a conversation for another webinar, but I believe
I hope we really have it. Churchill, just one last thing. In terms of models, and we've talked about, the other guys have talked about Instagram, TikTok models, etc. Is Nation going to be the same come next year? Is it going to be doing things the same way on your website with a paywall, or are you looking at doing something different and changing? And a corollary question to that will be, you saw the New York Times put out what their plan was, what their strategy was. I think they produced 2 documents and they've made them public. And I'm wondering whether Nation is going to do the same so that other people can learn from the approaches that you're doing.
The first question is no. And the best evidence of that is just to look back 12 months. What we were doing this time last year and what we are doing today are worlds apart. When I look at it, I know that we are not yet settled. We are not satisfied yet with what's happening. So quite a bit of change is still in the pipeline. And I can bet that the next 12 months is just going to be as dramatic going forward. As to whether we are going to publish reports similar to the New York Times, it's above my pay grade. So sorry to say, I'm not able to answer either way. No.
Either way. All right, no problem. Thanks a lot, guys, for participating. And our hour is up, so I'll just hand over back to Christine. And thanks a lot for everyone who's been here. So Christine, you can just take it on from there.
Wow, Njoki, challenge accepted. I'm going to be on TikTok, 6 seconds about BBI. That's I'm actually going to do it.
That's great.
Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, Gathara, for moderating, Churchill, Njoki, and Ephraim, for such a rich and insightful discussion. I was taking notes the entire time. And these are things that I am going to continue to be thinking about. And we at Baraza, we are going to keep thinking about and talking about. This is just the first of many conversations of this nature. So please follow us on our channels. We are at Baraza Lab on all the socials. And as well, feel free to follow our panelists as well on Twitter, Instagram, or wherever you'll find them online. This really is just